The Godfather is the most celebrated crime film ever made. It won 3 Academy Awards, made over $245 million at the box office in 1972, and is still ranked by the American Film Institute as the second greatest American film of all time. Francis Ford Coppola and Mario Puzo built something so convincing that it permanently shaped how the world thinks about organized crime bosses. The dignity, the loyalty, the code, the controlled violence, the patriarch who dies peacefully in his garden. Almost none of it is accurate. The real bosses were destroyed by syphilis, by their own paranoia, by a single tape recording of them saying the wrong thing about the wrong person, by soldiers who got frightened in prison and started talking. They died in federal medical facilities and exile apartments in Naples and on Manhattan sidewalks outside steakhouses. They were betrayed by their closest partners, their own fear, and, in at least one case, by the FBI they were secretly working for. This is what the movie refuses to show you. Section 1. Al Capone, the genius who rotted from inside out. Al Capone ran Chicago. Not metaphorically, actually ran it. By the late 1920s, he controlled the police, the politicians, the judges, and nearly every dollar of illegal money moving through the city. He had over 1,000 people working for him directly. He was 26 years old when he took over the operation. At his peak, his organization was pulling in roughly $60 million a year, the equivalent of close to $1 billion today. The Godfather gives us Vito Corleone. White hair, slow voice, absolute dignity. He ages like a patriarch. He dies on his own terms in his own garden, playing with his grandson, a tomato in his hand. It is one of the most peaceful exits ever given to a man who ordered people eliminated for a living. Al Capone did not get that exit. What actually happened to him is one of the most documented cases of a powerful man's mind and body collapsing in public, and it almost never comes up when people talk about his life. Capone had contracted syphilis in 1919, years before he ran anything. He got it from a brothel on the Lower East Side and never received proper treatment for it. In that era, the treatment was primitive and painful enough that many men avoided it entirely. Capone avoided it. He married May Coughlin in 1918, had a son, Sonny, and kept moving. The illness sat in his body for years, dormant and invisible, while he built his empire above it. By the time federal authorities sent him to prison in 1931 on tax charges, not for any of the violence, not for any of the hundreds of operations he ran, but for failing to pay taxes, the disease had already begun working on his brain. The condition is called neurosyphilis. It happens when the bacteria that causes syphilis crosses into the central nervous system and begins destroying it from the inside. It is slow. It is irreversible. And it takes with it, piece by piece, the exact things that made Capone who he was. His sharpness, his memory, his ability to read a room. He arrived at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1932. Guards and fellow inmates noticed almost immediately that something was wrong. He was confused at times. He had difficulty following conversations. A man who had spent over a decade making rapid, precise decisions about money, territory, and people was now losing track of where he was. By the time he transferred to Alcatraz in 1934, the most secure federal prison in the country, he was not the most dangerous man there. He was the most talked about, but for the wrong reasons. Other prisoners mocked him openly. He was stabbed in the back with a pair of scissors by a fellow inmate named James Lucas in 1936, which would have been unthinkable for the man who once walked into any room in Chicago and owned it. He spent more time in the Alcatraz hospital ward than in the general prison population. The hospital records confirm it. He was not running anything. He was not managing anything. He was deteriorating in a medical ward on an island in San Francisco Bay. When he was released in 1939 after serving nearly 8 years, the doctors who examined him determined that his mental age had effectively regressed. The most feared boss in American history walked out of Alcatraz with the cognitive function of someone who could no longer safely manage his own affairs. His wife, May, and his family took him to their home in Palm Island, Florida. He lived there for the next 8 years, largely removed from public life, his world shrinking down to the house, the yard, the people who took care of him. He never ran anything again. He never gave orders again. He never sat at the head of a table again. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone had a stroke. He died the same day of cardiac arrest. He was 48 years old. The contrast between the Capone the world knew, the fur coats, the bodyguards, the restaurants that cleared when he walked in, the city that bent around his will, and the Capone who spent his final years being managed by his wife in a Florida house is jarring specifically because the film version of this life leaves no room for it. The movie gangster ages into power or ages into tragedy. He does not age into confusion and dependency. He does not get taken down by something he caught in a brothel before anyone had even heard of him. What Capone's case actually shows is something the Godfather works very hard to avoid. The body does not care about status. The same man who evaded federal investigators for a decade could not evade bacteria. The same intelligence that restructured organized crime across an entire city could not restructure its way out of a disease that had been running its own quiet operations since 1919. His fall was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no betrayal scene, no moment of operatic reckoning. His mind just slowly stopped working in a prison hospital, surrounded by people who had no particular respect for who he used to be. That is the part that never makes it into the movie. The way Capone ended tells us something important about the gap between how power looks from the outside and what is actually happening inside the man holding it. And Capone is actually one of the more straightforward cases. At least the thing that destroyed him came from outside the organization. The next case is a man who built his entire empire on the belief that loyalty was absolute. He was wrong, and the proof came from a single conversation his most trusted partner overheard on a tape recording, a conversation in which the boss had been talking about him. Section 2. John Gotti, the man whose mouth convicted him. John Gotti knew the FBI was watching. He had known for years. He never used the phone for anything that mattered. When he needed to talk to his people, he walked through the streets of Ozone Park, through Little Italy, slow conversations on moving feet where no microphone could catch him. For years, this worked. The FBI tried bug after bug in his clubs and came up mostly empty. They admitted internally by 1987 that they had limited success with electronic surveillance on him. Then, they found the apartment above the Ravenite Social Club. An elderly woman had been paid to vacate her apartment on Mulberry Street, which sat directly above the club where Gotti held his most important meetings. The FBI got inside, planted a listening device inside a VCR, and wired it to a telephone line monitored from their Manhattan office. Gotti had no idea. For months, he sat in that building and talked, not cautiously, not carefully, but freely. The way a man talks when he believes the room belongs to him. What he said in those recordings was used to convict him of 13 charges in 1992. But the recordings did something else first, something the FBI did not fully anticipate. They handed them to Sammy Gravano. Salvatore Gravano had been Gotti's underboss. He had been with Gotti since before the 1985 removal of previous family boss, Paul Castellano. He had helped plan it, helped execute it, helped Gotti build everything that came after. He was arguably the most operationally useful person in the entire Gambino family. When Gotti and Gravano were both arrested in December 1990, It was widely assumed inside the organization that they would both stay quiet, do their time, and the family would manage from the outside. That assumption rested on the belief that Gotti had treated Gravano like a partner. The tapes showed otherwise. In one recording from December 12, 1989, Gotti spoke to another associate about Gravano's construction businesses. He was irritated. He complained about Gravano making money on the side, implied that Gravano was getting too independent, and spoke about him in a way that made clear he was being positioned as someone who might need to be dealt with. The FBI sat on those recordings. Then, after the arrests, they played them for Gravano. He listened to his boss talk about him like a problem to be managed. He agreed to cooperate within weeks. What followed was the most damaging testimony the American Mafia had faced since Joe Valachi sat in front of the Senate 30 years earlier. Gravano took the stand for 9 days. He confirmed 5 acts of fatal violence directly ordered by Gotti, including the removal of Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse. He described the planning, the participants, the locations, and the chain of command with the detail of someone who had been present for all of it. Because he had been. He confessed personally to involvement in 19 separate acts of fatal violence and served 5 years in exchange for his cooperation. Gotti had no answer for it. His lawyers could not discredit Gravano's testimony without essentially confirming it, because the two men had been inseparable for years. There was no version of events in which Gravano did not know what he knew. Gotti was convicted on all 13 counts on April 2, 1992. He went to Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois, the highest security federal facility in the country at the time. He spent the rest of his life there, eventually developing throat cancer. He received treatment, but the disease progressed. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti passed away at the facility. He was 61 years old. The press had called him the Teflon Don for years because charges kept sliding off him in the 1980s. 3 separate trials had ended without conviction. The nickname made him famous. It turned him into something close to a folk legend in parts of New York. He leaned into it. He wore expensive suits to court appearances. He waved to crowds. He gave interviews. He was, for a period, the most publicly visible organized crime figure in America. That visibility was precisely what made him vulnerable. Carlo Gambino, the man who built the family Gotti eventually took over, had spent decades being deliberately invisible. He lived in a modest house, dressed like a regular working man, and gave the FBI nothing to grab onto for years. Gambino passed away in 1976 without ever being convicted of anything serious. The contrast between how Gambino operated and how Gotti operated is not subtle. Gambino treated anonymity as his most important weapon. Gotti treated celebrity as protection. He was wrong about that. The deeper problem was not the FBI. The FBI had been trying to bring Gotti down for years and kept coming up short. What actually ended him was a management failure. He spoke carelessly about a man he needed on tape in a building he thought was safe. That man found out. And when given the choice between loyalty to someone who had been privately undermining him and cooperation with the government, he chose cooperation. The Godfather presents betrayal as the result of weakness or greed. Someone breaks under pressure, or someone gets bought. Gravano was neither weak nor bought. He was insulted. He heard himself discussed as a liability by someone he had spent years protecting. The decision followed from that. Loyalty in the real world, it turns out, has a very specific breaking point. It does not survive the moment you discover what your boss actually thinks of you. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the next case even more striking is that it involves a boss who never made that mistake. never got loud, never got visible, never gave anyone a reason to talk. He was the most powerful organized crime figure in American history, and most people on his own street had no idea who he was. Section 3. Carlo Gambino, the most powerful boss who looked like a grocer. Carlo Gambino arrived in the United States in 1921 as a stowaway on a freight ship. He was 19 years old, had no money, spoke no English, and had no legal status in the country. He would go on to become the most powerful organized crime figure in American history. By the time he passed away in 1976, the family bearing his name was pulling in an estimated $40 to $50 billion a year in revenue. The FBI, despite years of surveillance, could not build a case strong enough to put him away. He was never convicted of anything beyond a minor tax charge in 1937 that resulted in less than 2 years in prison. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He had a slight build and a quiet voice. People who did not know who he was described him as looking like someone who ran a small shop in Brooklyn. That was not an accident. Gambino understood something that almost no other boss of his era fully grasped. The most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is look powerful. Visibility attracts law enforcement. Visibility creates enemies. Visibility gives rivals a target and gives prosecutors a narrative. Everything about how Gambino carried himself was engineered to produce the opposite effect. He wore ordinary clothes. He lived in a modest row house in Brooklyn for most of his life. He did not hold court in expensive restaurants. He did not have his photograph taken if he could avoid it. When FBI agents placed his home under surveillance for 2 full years, they came away with almost nothing usable. The man who ran the most powerful criminal organization in the country refused to behave like it. The contrast with John Gotti, who took over the same family 11 years after Gambino passed away, is almost too clean to believe. Gotti wore hand-tailored suits and held outdoor 4th of July parties for his neighborhood in Queens, where thousands of people showed up. Gambino would have considered that a catastrophic failure of basic judgment. And the outcomes track exactly with the approaches. Gambino passed away in his own bed, a free man, at 74. Gotti passed away in a federal prison at 61. Gambino's rise was built on patience as much as anything else. He spent years as a lower-ranking member under Vincent Mangano, learning the organization, building relationships, accumulating trust. When Mangano disappeared in 1951, under circumstances that were never officially resolved, Albert Anastasia took over the family. Anastasia was one of the most feared men in the New York underworld, brutal, impulsive, and prone to using violence as a first response rather than a last one. He made Gambino his underboss. 4 years later, in 1957, Anastasia was shot and eliminated in a Manhattan barber shop while sitting in the chair getting a haircut. Gambino took over the family. Law enforcement and rival bosses spent years trying to figure out exactly what Gambino had or had not known about Anastasia's removal. They never got a clean answer. That was characteristic. Gambino operated in a way that made it genuinely difficult to trace decisions back to him. He was not running from accountability the way a frightened man runs. He was structuring his operation so that accountability was simply never available. After the 1957 Appalachian meeting in upstate New York, a gathering of organized crime figures from across the country that was raided by state police, resulting in 58 bosses being identified and indicted, Gambino emerged as the dominant figure on the National Commission. The raid embarrassed almost every other boss who had attended. Gambino somehow managed to avoid the worst of the fallout. By 1959, when Vito Genovese went to prison on narcotics charges, there was no serious challenger to Gambino's position at the top of the hierarchy. He held that position for nearly 2 decades without being touched. In 1969, he was finally charged with conspiracy to commit armed robbery and truck hijacking. His legal team delayed the proceedings for years. During that time, federal authorities discovered that Gambino had never actually become an American citizen. He had entered the country illegally on that freight ship in 1921 and had never resolved his immigration status. The government began deportation proceedings. His doctors provided documentation stating that his heart condition made him too ill to travel. The proceedings dragged on. There were reports, never officially confirmed, that Gambino had paid 2 U.S. senators to help delay the case. Nothing was proven. He passed away before either the criminal case or the deportation case reached a conclusion. On the morning of October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino sat in his Long Island home in Massapequa, watching the New York Yankees play. He had a cardiac episode and passed away. He was 74 years old, at home, surrounded by family, a free man. For federal law enforcement, it was genuinely insulting. They had surveilled him, investigated him, charged him, and pursued deportation against him. None of it landed. He simply outlived the effort. His funeral drew thousands of people to a Brooklyn church, where he lay in state for 2 days. FBI agents lined the streets outside, photographing attendees and recording license plates, trying to map the organization one last time. The family he left behind still bears his name today. Gambino remains the clearest proof that the image of the boss, the commanding presence, the visible authority, the man everyone in the room knows is in charge, is not how the most successful ones actually operated. The real version was quieter, smaller, and considerably more difficult to catch. But even Gambino's careful, methodical approach could not solve the problem that destroyed the next boss on this list. Because that boss was not brought down by law enforcement at all. He was removed by his own people on a busy Manhattan street during the Christmas shopping rush. And the man who arranged it had been sitting 2 feet away from him for years. Section 4. Paul Castellano, removed by his own family on a Manhattan street. Paul Castellano was 70 years old on the evening of December 16, 1985. He was the sitting boss of the Gambino family, at that point still considered the most powerful organized crime organization in the United States. He had been in the position since 1976, when Carlo Gambino, his cousin and brother-in-law, hand-picked him as successor over the objections of several senior family members who felt the choice was nepotism over merit. Those objections never fully went away. Castellano pulled up to Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan just before 5:30 in the evening. It was the Christmas season. The streets were full of shoppers. His driver and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti, was behind the wheel. They were headed to a meeting with senior family members inside the restaurant. 4 men in trench coats and fur hats were waiting outside. As Castellano stepped out of the car, they opened fire. He was shot multiple times and collapsed on the sidewalk beside a lamppost. Bilotti was shot as he got out of the driver's side and fell in the street a few feet away. Both men passed away at the scene. The shooters walked away on foot into the crowd. Across the street, in a parked car, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano watched. Before leaving, Gotti had his driver slowly pass the scene to confirm both men were down. This was not a rival family moving on the Gambinos. This was the Gambinos moving on themselves. To understand why, you have to understand what Castellano had become to the men beneath him. He lived in a large home on Staten Island that people inside the organization called the White House, an estate that was a visible daily reminder of the distance between him and the people doing actual work on the street. He was rarely seen in the neighborhoods where his family operated. He was consumed with legitimate business interests, particularly in construction and meat distribution, and had developed a reputation among his crews as someone more interested in business percentages than in the men earning them. He had also made a specific decision that the family would not get involved in narcotics trafficking. His reasoning was strategic. Narcotics brought federal mandatory minimum sentences and created enormous pressure on lower-level members to cooperate with investigators. But the crews saw it differently. They were watching other families make serious money from the trade, while Castellano drew a line they had no say in drawing. Underneath all of this ran a personal element that turned out to matter more than any policy. Aniello Della Croce was the family underboss, a senior figure who commanded deep loyalty from a significant portion of the organization, including John Gotti's crew. Della Croce had been passed over when Gambino chose Castellano as boss, and had spent years as a quiet counterweight to Castellano's authority. As long as Della Croce was alive, there was a kind of internal equilibrium. The faction that resented Castellano had a respected senior figure to answer to, which kept things stable. Della Croce passed away from cancer on December 2, 1985. 14 days later, Castellano was gone. The timing was not a coincidence. The faction around Gotti had been considering the move for some time, but Della Croce's presence had been a check on it. Once he was gone, the check was gone with him. What accelerated things further was that Castellano did not attend Della Croce's wake. He cited his ongoing legal troubles and his desire to keep a low profile, given that he was facing a serious racketeering indictment. Inside the organization, not showing up to the wake of a senior figure who had died was read as a fundamental breach of respect. It hardened the people who were already looking for a reason to move. According to testimony later given by Gravano at Gotti's 1992 trial, the decision was not made by a single person acting out of pure ambition. It was reached by a small coalition. Gotti, Gravano, and family captain Frank DeCicco, who each concluded that the risks of leaving Castellano in place outweighed the risks of removing him. The concern was partly that Castellano, facing his own federal case, might eventually make a deal with prosecutors. That was not confirmed, but the fear of it was real enough to function as justification. The removal of a sitting boss without commission approval was a serious violation of the rules that were supposed to govern how these organizations operated. Normally, removing a boss required the blessing of the broader leadership structure. Gotti did not seek it. He planned the operation, assembled the team, picked the date and location, and executed it. Nobody stopped him. Nobody moved against him afterward. He called a meeting of family captains shortly after and presented the situation as settled. Most fell in line. The ones who did not were dealt with in the following months. What the Castellano case demonstrates, stripped of any cinematic framing, is that the loyalty and order presented in films about organized crime were always conditional. The rules existed until someone powerful enough decided they did not apply. Castellano believed his position protected him, that the structure of the organization, the tradition, the fact that he was the sitting boss of the most powerful family in the country, created a kind of institutional safety. It did not. He was removed because a faction within his own organization decided it was time, and because nothing in the actual power structure was strong enough to stop them once they committed to it. He never saw it coming. The meeting at the restaurant was a normal meeting. His own people had arranged it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is different in almost every way. A boss who was not removed from power by rivals or by his own people, but who walked away from the most powerful position in American organized crime and spent the rest of his life unable to return to the country he had spent decades shaping. No confrontation, no street corner, just an exile that never ended. Section 5. Lucky Luciano, the man who built American organized crime, died in homesick exile. Charles Luciano restructured the entire American underworld. That is not an exaggeration. Before he came along, the organized crime landscape in the United States was a collection of warring factions run by older Sicilian bosses who refused to work with anyone outside their specific ethnic and regional circles. Luciano saw that as a structural inefficiency. He changed it. In 1931, he orchestrated the removal of two of the most powerful old guard bosses, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, within months of each other. With both men gone, Luciano reorganized what remained into a national structure. He created the Commission, a governing body that gave the major families a formal way to resolve disputes and make collective decisions. He brought in Jewish organized crime figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel as genuine partners rather than subordinates, which no Italian boss of his generation had been willing to do. He turned a collection of competing street operations into something closer to a functioning national enterprise. He was 34 years old when he did this. By the mid-1930s, Luciano was running prostitution, narcotics distribution, loan sharking, and gambling operations across New York, with influence extending across the country through the commission structure he had built. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey made Luciano his primary target. In 1936, Dewey successfully convicted Luciano on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence was 30 to 50 years. He went to prison. He kept running things from inside. Then the war changed his situation in an unexpected way. In 1942, the U.S. Navy approached federal authorities about a problem. German submarines were appearing to have advanced knowledge of Allied shipping routes in the Atlantic, and there was concern about enemy operatives working the New York docks. The longshoremen's unions that controlled those docks were, in practical terms, managed by organized crime. The Navy needed cooperation. Federal authorities went to Luciano. The details of what exactly Luciano provided have remained partially classified and disputed by historians for decades. What is documented is that sabotage on the docks stopped and that cooperation with the Navy did occur through Luciano's people. In 1946, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted and convicted him a decade earlier, commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition of immediate and permanent deportation to Italy. Luciano was furious about the deportation clause. He had spent his entire adult life in the United States. He had built everything he had there. Italy was a country he had left as a child. On February 10, 1946, he was transferred from prison to a ship and sent to Italy. He was 48 years old and had been told he could never return. He did not accept this quietly. Within months, he made his way to Cuba. Cuba in 1946 was being developed as a major hub for American organized crime, particularly in the casino and hotel industries. Luciano established himself in Havana, obtained a Cuban visa using his Italian passport, and called a major gathering of American organized crime figures at the Hotel Nacional in December of that year. It became known as the Havana Conference. Senior figures from across the country attended. Frank Sinatra was present during the same period, a fact that attracted press attention. Luciano, for a brief window, was back at the center of things. It did not last. Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, became aware that Luciano was operating in the Western Hemisphere and formally demanded that Cuba remove him. When Cuba initially resisted, the U.S. government threatened to cut off pharmaceutical exports to the island. Cuba deported Luciano back to Italy in 1947. He spent the rest of his life in Naples under close Italian police surveillance. He was not permitted to travel. He met with American tourists who recognized him. He spoke frequently about how much he missed the United States.
Investigators who monitored him noted that he was genuinely homesick in a way that went beyond frustration. He had built an American life, an American identity, and an American organization, and all of it was permanently on the other side of an ocean he was not allowed to cross. He made attempts over the years to leverage whatever political connections he still had into some kind of arrangement that would allow him to return. Nothing worked. The U.S. government had no interest in letting him back in, and the condition of his release had been permanent deportation with no exceptions. In his later years, Luciano began working with a journalist on his memoirs. He was also in discussions with a film and television producer about a project based on his life. On January 26, 1962, he went to Naples Airport to meet with the producer. He collapsed in the terminal and passed away of a cardiac episode. He was 64 years old. His body was eventually returned to the United States, the country he had been banned from for the last 16 years of his life, and buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York. The Godfather presents power as something that, at its highest levels, comes with a kind of permanence. The boss controls the territory, the family, the future. Luciano's actual ending dismantles that entirely. The man who designed the system was ejected from it by a government that used his own wartime cooperation as partial justification for putting him on a boat. He spent his final decade and a half talking to tourists in Naples and trying to sell his story to a film producer. The organization he built continued operating without him for decades. He did not get to be part of any of it.
The next case is about a boss who never left the country, never lost his power to a prosecutor, and was never betrayed by his own people, but who still managed to destroy his own empire entirely from the inside through nothing but his own escalating suspicion of everyone around him. Section 6. Vito Genovese, the boss who destroyed his own empire through paranoia. Vito Genovese spent 30 years clawing his way to the top of the American underworld. He was involved in the 1931 removal of Joe Masseria, one of the two killings that cleared the way for Luciano's restructuring of organized crime. He built a reputation as someone ruthless enough to act when others hesitated, and patient enough to wait years for the right moment. By 1957, with Lucky Luciano permanently exiled in Italy and Frank Costello weakened by a failed attempt on his life, Genovese had maneuvered himself into the position he had been working toward for decades. He was effectively the boss of all bosses in New York. 2 years later, he was in federal prison. And from inside that prison, over the next 10 years, he systematically destroyed everything he had built. The narcotics conviction that sent him away in 1959 was, in Genovese's own mind, a setup. He believed that rivals, specifically Meyer Lansky and others connected to the old Luciano network, had arranged to have an informant plant evidence against him. Whether that belief was accurate has never been definitively established. What is established is that Genovese held that belief with total certainty and acted on it continuously from his prison cell. He was sent first to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, then later to the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth in Kansas. He continued directing family operations from inside. Correspondence was monitored. Visits were restricted. None of that stopped him from issuing instructions, and none of those instructions, as the years went on, were about growing the business. They were about settling scores. His first major target from prison was Anthony Strollo, known as Tony Bender, one of his most senior and trusted lieutenants on the outside. Genovese became convinced that Bender had been involved in the narcotics setup. In 1962, Bender walked out of his Fort Lee, New Jersey home and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. His removal was never officially attributed to anyone in a court of law, but within the organization, it was understood to have come from Genovese's instructions. Then came Joe Valachi. Valachi was a soldier in the Genovese family, a low-ranking member who had been convicted on narcotics charges and was serving time in Atlanta at the same time as Genovese. In prison, the relationship between the two men deteriorated.
Valachi became convinced, based on what he interpreted as signals from Genovese, including what he described as a kiss on the cheek that he believed to be a mark of condemnation, that Genovese had ordered him eliminated. Acting on that fear, Valachi attacked a fellow prisoner in June 1962 with a metal pipe, believing him to be the person sent to carry out the order. He had the wrong man. The prisoner he attacked, Joseph Sopp, passed away from the injuries. Valachi was charged with the act and received a life sentence. Now facing permanent imprisonment with no prospect of release and genuinely terrified of what Genovese would do next, Valachi made a decision that fractured the American Mafia in ways it never fully recovered from. He agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. In October 1963, he testified before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in televised hearings that were watched by millions of Americans. He confirmed the existence of Cosa Nostra publicly for the first time. He named the 5 families. He described the structure, the initiation rituals, the commission, the hierarchy from boss down to soldier. He identified senior figures by name. He explained how the organization made decisions and how it enforced them. Before Valachi, the federal government had been building cases largely from the outside, working with partial information. After Valachi, they had a functional map of the entire American Mafia, drawn by someone who had spent decades inside it. All of this happened because Genovese, from his prison cell, had generated enough fear in a low-level soldier to push him across a line that had never been crossed before. The institutional damage was enormous. Valachi's testimony directly led to increased resources for organized crime prosecution, contributed to the eventual development of the RICO statutes that would be used to dismantle multiple families in the 1980s, and established a template for cooperation that other members would follow in the decades ahead. The code of silence that had protected organized crime for generations had its first major public breach, not because of skilled law enforcement work, not because of electronic surveillance, but because a boss in prison had frightened one of his own men past the point of no return. Meanwhile, the family Genovese had worked his entire life to build was slipping away from him. Carlo Gambino, operating freely on the outside while Genovese was locked down in Leavenworth, quietly consolidated influence among the New York families. The commission that Genovese had once dominated shifted around him. Senior figures who might have remained loyal to Genovese found it more practical to align with Gambino, who was present, accessible, and not issuing removal orders from a prison cell. By the time Genovese passed away of heart failure on February 14, 1969, at the Federal Medical Facility in Springfield, Missouri, the family he had named after himself had already realigned its loyalties elsewhere. He had served 10 years of his 15-year sentence. He was 71 years old. The organization he left behind had structurally moved on without him years before his actual passing. He never cooperated with authorities. He never broke his silence. In that narrow sense, he stayed true to the code to the end. But the practical result of his decade in prison was that his own paranoia had triggered more damage to organized crime in America than most law enforcement operations managed to achieve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case runs in almost the exact opposite direction. A boss who kept total silence, left almost no trace, and pulled off something that should have been impossible, becoming the single most powerful organized crime figure in American history while looking to almost everyone who saw him like a perfectly unremarkable old man. Section 7.
Salvatore Riina, the boss of bosses who lived like a nobody. Salvatore Riina was the most wanted man in Italy for 23 years. During that time, he directed the Sicilian Mafia through its most violent and destructive period in history. He ordered the eliminations of rival bosses, senior police officials, judges, prosecutors, and anyone else who posed a threat to his control. He was personally responsible, according to court findings, for orchestrating acts of violence that left hundreds of people dead across Sicily and the Italian mainland.
He was convicted in absentia at the 1986 Maxi trial and sentenced to life imprisonment before anyone had even caught him. While all of this was happening, he was living in an apartment in Palermo, not a compound, not a fortified estate in the countryside, an apartment in the city he controlled, in a residential complex belonging to a wealthy businessman who served as his driver. He had a wife, Antonia Bagarella, whom he had married in 1974 while already a fugitive. They had 4 children together. The family lived an ordinary domestic life in the middle of a city where his name was spoken with genuine fear. He had gone into hiding in 1969 after being acquitted of a triple homicide charge. From that point forward, he maintained no official existence. He had no registered address, no documented employment, no legal identity in any Italian government record. He moved through Palermo not as a ghost, but as an unremarkable private citizen. Neighbors in the area where he was eventually captured had no idea who he was. For 23 years, the Italian state, including the Carabinieri, the police, and multiple specialized anti-mafia units, could not find him. The operation that finally located him began in August 1992, in the immediate aftermath of 2 events that had shocked Italy and much of the world. On May 23, 1992, anti-mafia magistrate Giovanni Falcone was traveling from Palermo Airport with his wife and a police escort when a massive explosion destroyed a section of the highway. Falcone, his wife, and 3 of his police escorts were killed. Less than 2 months later, on July 19, 1992, Magistrate Paolo Borsellino was eliminated in a car bombing outside his mother's apartment building in Palermo, along with 5 members of his police escort. Both Falcone and Borsellino had been the primary architects of the Maxi trial. Their eliminations were ordered by Riina. The public reaction in Italy was unlike anything the country had seen in years. The bombings had crossed a line that even many people within organized crime considered extreme. The pressure on Italian law enforcement to find Riina became enormous. A specialized Carabinieri unit began a new focused investigation. The breakthrough came from a man named Baldassare Di Maggio. Di Maggio had been a trusted associate of Riina's, a former commander of a mafia district in Sicily who had been displaced from his position and forced to flee to northern Italy after internal disputes within the organization. The Carabinieri located him in the town of Borgo Manero in Piedmont and arrested him on January 8, 1993. That same evening, Di Maggio began cooperating. He told investigators that he had met with Riina personally on multiple occasions in Palermo and could identify the general area where Riina was living. He identified Riina's wife near the entrance of the residential complex where they lived. On the morning of January 15, 1993, a Carabinieri unit led by Captain Sergio De Caprio, operating under the code name Ultimo, positioned themselves on the Via Regione Siciliana. At 9 in the morning, a car carrying Riina pulled into traffic. The unit blocked the vehicle. Riina was inside. His response, according to documented accounts from the arresting officers, was to tell them they were making a big mistake. He was 62 years old. He had been a fugitive for 23 years. He was taken into custody without resistance. At the time of his arrest, Italian authorities searched the apartment where he had been living. What they found was consistent with the life of an ordinary private family. There was no weapons cache, no operations center, no evidence of the kind of infrastructure that cinematic portrayals of crime bosses typically involve. The most wanted man in Italy
had been living like a retired tradesman in a residential Palermo apartment complex.
Rina was placed under the Article 41 bis prison regime, a special Italian law designed specifically for senior organized crime figures and those convicted of serious crimes against the state. Under 41 bis, prisoners are held in near total isolation. Contact with other inmates is essentially eliminated. Visits from family are severely restricted and conducted through glass barriers. Correspondence is monitored comprehensively. The regime was created precisely because of cases like Rina, bosses who continued directing operations from ordinary prison cells. He refused to cooperate with investigators at any point after his arrest. He refused to become a pentito, the Italian term for a mafia member who turns informant. Through decades of imprisonment and multiple trials that added conviction after conviction to his record, he maintained complete silence toward law enforcement. Italian state radio described him in a phrase that became well known as mute as a tomb. He received 26 separate life sentences across various trials. He passed away on November 17, 2017, in a prison hospital in Parma from complications following surgery. He was 87 years old. His family requested a funeral in his hometown of Corleone. The local archbishop refused to permit a public ceremony, describing him as a public sinner whose actions placed him outside the boundaries of a normal Catholic burial rite. His body was returned to Corleone privately. Rina's case dismantles one of the most persistent ideas that organized crime films rely on: that a boss at the top of a powerful organization lives with a corresponding level of visible power. The reality was the opposite. His survival for over 2 decades depended entirely on looking like no one at all.
What makes the next case almost a mirror image is that it involves a boss whose power was never invisible. It was built in plain sight, through a relationship with federal law enforcement, while he spent years publicly condemning the very behavior he was engaged in privately. Section 8. Whitey Bulger, the boss who used the FBI as his personal enforcement arm. James Bulger ran South Boston. He led the Winter Hill Gang, controlled the drug trade, the gambling operations, and the loan sharking in his territory, and maintained his position through a combination of genuine menace and carefully cultivated public image. In the neighborhood where he operated, he was known as someone who kept hard drugs away from local kids and looked after the community. That reputation was largely constructed and partially false, but it held for years. What almost nobody in South Boston knew was that while Bulger was building this image, he was simultaneously one of the FBI's most active informants. He had been recruited as a confidential informant in the early 1970s by FBI agent John Connolly, who had grown up in the same public housing project in South Boston where Bulger was a neighborhood figure. Connolly had joined the FBI and risen through the Boston office at a time when the Bureau's national priority was dismantling the Italian-American Mafia. Informants who could provide intelligence on La Cosa Nostra were career currency. Connolly pitched Bulger to his superiors as exactly that kind of asset. The arrangement that followed was supposed to work in one direction. Bulger would provide information on the New England Mafia. The FBI would use that information to build cases. That is not what happened. Bulger provided enough genuine intelligence on the Italian families to make himself credible and valuable to the Bureau.
The New England Mafia's leadership was decimated through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, with prosecutions built in significant part on information that came through Connolly's informant network. The FBI's Boston office considered this a major success. Internally, Bulger was regarded as a high-value asset who was producing results. What the FBI did not fully account for, or chose not to examine, was what Bulger was getting out of the relationship. Connolly was feeding him information, not occasionally and not incidentally. He told Bulger about ongoing investigations into the Winter Hill Gang. He identified other informants who were providing information on Bulger's operations.
He tipped Bulger off when law enforcement was preparing to move against him. At least one person involved in providing information to investigators was located and eliminated after Connolly shared their identity with Bulger.
The FBI, in practical terms, had become a tool that Bulger was using to eliminate competition and protect his own operation.
A retired FBI supervisor named Robert Fitzpatrick, who served as assistant special agent in charge of the Boston office, later testified that he had assessed Bulger in 1981 and recommended that he be terminated as an informant. His assessment was that Bulger was not providing useful information and showed no willingness to cooperate in any meaningful way. When Fitzpatrick met with Bulger directly, Bulger changed the subject repeatedly, acted aggressively, and at one point stated flat out that he was not an informant. Fitzpatrick sent his recommendation up the chain. His supervisors did not act on it. Bulger remained on the books as an active FBI informant. By the mid-1980s, multiple law enforcement agencies outside the FBI's Boston office had developed serious concerns about the relationship.
State police investigators and DEA agents working on cases involving the Winter Hill Gang repeatedly found their operations compromised in ways that pointed toward an inside source. Their attempts to raise these concerns formally within the system were largely stonewalled. The FBI's institutional investment in protecting its informant relationship with Bulger had created a situation where outside agencies could not get traction even when their evidence was substantial. In 1994, a federal indictment against Bulger was prepared. Connolly learned about it and warned him. On the night of December 23, 1994, Bulger left Boston with his longtime companion, Catherine Gregg. He did not come back. He was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. For the next 16 years, reported sightings came in from locations around the world. Various task forces were assembled and reassembled. The search became one of the longest and most expensive fugitive investigations in federal history. He had never left the United States. Bulger and Gregg were living in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, California, a few blocks from the Pacific Ocean. He had been there for years. He kept cash hidden in the walls. Investigators found $822,000 when they searched the apartment after his arrest. Additional money was later recovered from safety deposit boxes in Montreal, Dublin, London, and Clearwater, Florida. He had been careful with how he spent it, living modestly and attracting no attention from neighbors who knew him only as a quiet older man named Charlie. The arrest came on June 22, 2011, after the FBI ran a targeted media campaign in areas with high populations of older women, reasoning that Gregg was more likely to be recognized than Bulger. A former neighbor called in the tip within days of the ads running. Bulger was lured to the building's parking garage and taken into custody. He was 81 years old. At his 2013 trial, he was convicted of participating in 11 killings and a range of other serious charges. He received 2 life sentences plus 5 years and was sent to federal prison. On October 30, 2018, less than 12 hours after being transferred to a federal facility in West Virginia, Bulger was found in his cell having been fatally beaten. Investigators believed the attack was carried out by inmates with organized crime connections, who regarded him as a person who had violated the most fundamental rule of the criminal world he had spent his life in. He had been an informant for decades. In the end, the thing that defined his career became the thing that ended his life. The Godfather draws a clean line between those who cooperate with law enforcement and those who do not. Bulger's case shows that line was never clean. A man who publicly built his identity on contempt for informants was the FBI's most active informant for 20 years, using the relationship to eliminate rivals and protect his operation in ways the film version of this world pretends is not possible. Before we move on,
If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves someone who broke the code not to protect himself, not to eliminate rivals, but because the organization he had devoted his life to had started eliminating his children. And he decided that changed everything. Section 9. Tommaso Buscetta, the man the Mafia turned into its own worst enemy. Tommaso Buscetta was not a low-level soldier who got scared and talked. He was not a mid-ranking member pressured into cooperation by a long prison sentence. He was a senior figure in the Sicilian Mafia, a man with deep roots in Cosa Nostra going back decades. Someone who had operated across Italy, the United States, Brazil, Venezuela, and Mexico, and built connections in each place. Inside the organization, he was known as the boss of two worlds. He believed in Cosa Nostra as an institution. He believed in its rules, its structure, and its code. Then the Corleonesi faction, led by Salvatore Riina, started eliminating his family. In 1982, two of Buscetta's sons were taken by Corleonesi hitmen in Palermo. Their bodies were never found. Investigators and subsequent testimony indicated that the remains had been dissolved in acid, a method used by the Corleoneses specifically to prevent families from recovering their dead and to eliminate any forensic trace. That same year, Buscetta's brother was eliminated. His son-in-law was eliminated. His nephew was eliminated. Across 1982 alone, the number of Buscetta's relatives killed by the Corleonesi reached into double figures by some accounts, with historians and court documents identifying between 10 and 14 family members lost to the internal mafia war that Riina was conducting to consolidate total control of Cosa Nostra. Buscetta was in Brazil at the time, having fled Sicily years earlier as the violence escalated. He was not present for any of these eliminations. He found out about them one by one from a distance, unable to respond and unable to protect anyone. In October 1983, Brazilian authorities arrested him in Sao Paulo. He was wanted in both Italy and the United States. Italy was granted extradition first. On June 28, 1984, he was transferred to Italian custody and flown back to the country. During the flight, or shortly after arrival according to some accounts, Buscetta attempted to take his own life by ingesting barbiturates. The attempt failed. Italian authorities intervened, and he survived. After that, something shifted. Anti-mafia magistrate Giovanni Falcone was assigned to work with him. Falcone was careful, methodical, and unusually knowledgeable about Sicilian mafia structure for a prosecutor at that point. He did not approach Buscetta as a hostile witness to be broken. He approached him as someone who might choose to speak if given the right conditions and the right reasons. The two men met and began a process that would last for weeks. Buscetta started talking on July 16, 1984. Before he began, he warned Falcone directly. He told him that the decision to cooperate was a dangerous one for both of them. He told Falcone that the Mafia would try to eliminate him, and that they would keep trying until they succeeded. Falcone acknowledged the warning and continued. Buscetta then proceeded to provide, over 45 days of detailed sessions, the most comprehensive insider account of Sicilian Mafia structure that Italian law enforcement had ever received. He described the hierarchy in precise terms. He confirmed the existence of the cupola, the supreme governing body of Cosa Nostra, and explained how it functioned. He named the bosses of the individual clans, described how decisions were made, explained the rules governing conduct between members, and provided a framework for understanding the organization that Falcone later said transformed the entire Italian approach to prosecuting organized crime. Falcone's own words on the subject, recorded in documents and interviews from the period, described Buscetta as having provided a language and a code that allowed investigators to finally communicate with a world they had been observing from the outside. In September 1984, using information provided by Buscetta and other cooperating witnesses who followed his lead, Italian authorities carried out an operation known as the Blitz of San Michele, arresting 366 people connected to Cosa Nostra in a single coordinated action. The paperwork underpinning those arrests, including the formal committal order for what would become the Maxi trial, was written by Falcone and his colleague Paolo Borsellino. The Maxi trial began in Palermo in 1986 and concluded in 1987. It was the largest organized crime prosecution in history. Over 450 defendants were tried simultaneously in a specially constructed bunker courthouse built adjacent to the Ucciardone prison. Buscetta testified. The proceedings resulted in convictions for 360 defendants, with sentences totaling over 2,665 years of imprisonment combined, plus multiple life sentences. Buscetta was placed in the United States Federal Witness Protection Program and given a new identity and American citizenship. Over the following years, he continued to testify in both Italian and American proceedings. He appeared as a witness in the Pizza Connection trial in New York, a major narcotics trafficking case involving the Sicilian and American mafias. He testified before the Italian Anti-Mafia Commission after the eliminations of Falcone and Borsellino in 1992, providing additional information linking mafia activity to Italian political figures. Falcone was eliminated on May 23, 1992, exactly as Buscetta had warned. A massive bomb destroyed a section of the A29 highway near Palermo as Falcone's motorcade passed over it. His wife and 3 police escorts were also killed. Borsellino was eliminated less than 2 months later in a car bombing outside his mother's building. Buscetta passed away on April 2, 2000, in the United States from natural causes. He was 71 years old. He had spent the last 16 years of his life in witness protection. His decision to cooperate is sometimes framed in popular accounts as a betrayal of the organization he belonged to. Buscetta consistently rejected that framing. His position, stated repeatedly in testimony and interviews, was that Rina had already betrayed Cosa Nostra by abandoning its rules, by eliminating the families of members rather than the members themselves, and by turning the organization into something unrecognizable from what it had been. He was not breaking a code he believed in. He was responding to the fact that the code had already been broken by the people running the organization. That distinction matters because it gets to something the Godfather cannot accommodate. The film's world runs on loyalty as a stable foundation.
Buscetta's case shows that loyalty had a specific and identifiable breaking point, and that the organization itself, through its own conduct, created the conditions that destroyed it. The final case in this series is in some ways the starkest of all. A man who never reached the level of boss, never held significant power, and whose decision to speak changed the legal landscape of organized crime in America more permanently than almost any prosecution before or since. Section 10. Joe Valachi, the low-level soldier whose fear cracked the entire American Mafia. Joe Valachi was nobody special inside the American Mafia. That is not a dismissal. It is the most important fact about him. He was a soldier in the Genovese family, the lowest rung of formal membership in the organization. He ran gambling operations and had been involved in narcotics distribution. He had been a made member since 1930, which meant he had spent over 3 decades inside the organization by the time everything fell apart. He was not a boss. He was not an underboss. He was not a captain. He had no significant decision-making power and no particular standing beyond being a reliable, low-level earner. And yet what he did in 1963 did more lasting damage to the structural foundations of American organized crime than almost any single event before or since. The sequence that led to his cooperation began not with a law enforcement operation or a plea deal negotiation, but with a prison yard misidentification that cost an innocent man his life. Valachi was serving a 15-year sentence on narcotics charges at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in the early 1960s. Vito Genovese was also incarcerated there at the same time, serving his own narcotics sentence. The relationship between the two men deteriorated inside the prison. Valachi became convinced, based on what he interpreted as behavioral signals from Genovese and information filtering through the prison population, that Genovese had ordered a contract on his life. On June 22, 1962, Valachi approached a fellow inmate in the prison yard named Joseph Sopp and attacked him with a metal pipe, believing him to be the person assigned to carry out the order against him. Sopp was not involved in any such plan. He was the wrong man entirely. He passed away from the injuries 3 days later. Valachi was charged with the act and received a life sentence on top of the time he was already serving. He was now in permanent federal custody with no prospect of release, and he still believed Genovese was going to have him eliminated inside the prison system. The calculation he faced was straightforward and brutal. Stay silent, remain a target, and likely be reached eventually inside a facility where Genovese still had influence and connections. Or cooperate with federal authorities and accept whatever protection they could offer. He chose cooperation. Federal investigators who debriefed him quickly understood they had something genuinely significant. Valachi had been inside the organization for over 30 years. He had direct knowledge of operations, personnel, and structure going back to the foundational period of the American Mafia in the early 1930s. He had been present for events, conversations, and decisions that the government had been trying to document from the outside for decades. His information was not second-hand or speculative. It was the account of someone who had been in the room. In October 1963, Valachi testified before Senator John McClellan's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the U.S. Senate Committee on Government Operations. The hearings were televised nationally. Millions of Americans watched. What he said was, at that point in history, extraordinary. He confirmed that a formal organization called Cosa Nostra existed within the United States. He stated that the term Mafia was not used internally. The organization referred to itself as Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing. He described the 5 families of New York by name. He explained the commission, the governing body that Luciano had created in 1931 to manage disputes between the major families. He described the initiation ceremony in detail, the oath, the burning of the saint's card in the new members' hands, the pledge that the organization came before family, before country, before everything. He named senior figures across multiple families and described their roles and relationships. He drew an organizational chart of the New York Mafia on a large board in the hearing room, in front of the senators, the cameras, and the watching public. Before Valachi testified, the federal government's official position had been essentially that a formal national organized crime structure probably existed, but could not be proven. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had for years publicly downplayed the existence of the Mafia as a formal organization, preferring to focus on individual criminals rather than institutional structures. Valachi's testimony made that position impossible to maintain. He had described the institution from the inside in specific, verifiable, cross-referenceable detail. The impact on law enforcement was direct and measurable. Following the hearings, the Justice Department significantly expanded its organized crime and racketeering section. New strike force offices were established across the country, focused specifically on organized crime prosecution. Legislative proposals that had been stalled for years, including provisions for electronic surveillance and witness immunity, gained momentum. The legal architecture that eventually produced the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statutes that would be used to dismantle multiple families in the 1980s and 1990s, was built in significant part on the foundation that the Valachi hearings established by proving the organizational structure existed. Valachi himself never left federal custody. He was moved between facilities for his own protection. He wrote a detailed memoir by hand while in prison, which later became the basis for the book The Valachi Papers.
He passed away on April 3, 1971, at the Federal Correctional Institution in La Tuna, Texas. He was 66 years old. Natural causes. Still in custody. Still, as far as anyone knew, alive only because the government had kept him separated from the people who wanted him eliminated.
He had broken the code of silence for one reason. He was afraid of being reached inside a prison. Not for money, not for ideology, not out of guilt about anything he had done. Pure, functional fear of a specific outcome he was trying to avoid. The organization's response to what he had done, the fury, the sense of catastrophic betrayal, reflects how much damage one frightened soldier with 3 decades of institutional memory could do when the thing protecting that memory, the threat of consequences for talking, stopped working. Everything examined across these 10 cases points toward the same conclusion, and that conclusion is almost the exact opposite of what The Godfather asks you to believe. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.